The 1910s saw major political struggles between the conservatives and the ever-growing progressive movement. By this decade, the progressive movement had gained enough momentum to inspire blue-collar workers to stand up against unfair treatment and taking matters into their own hands. This decade saw many strikes, several of which were massive. But the success of these strikes were extremely limited, with the police and even the National Guard being called in to break them up and all but force people to go back to work. Today we will talk about 3 strikes during this time. The strike leading to the Ludlow Massacre, also known as the Colorado Coalfield War, 1913 to 1914, the Boston Telephone Strike, and the Seattle General Strike. In 1910, the coal industry was absolutely massive, especially in Colorado. During this time, 16,000 workers were employed in this industry, accounting for roughly 10% of the entire job market. What was also noteworthy about Colorado's coal industry was the death rate, as it was double the national average, with over 100 men dying on the job by the end of the year. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company was one of the most powerful mining companies during this time, and one of the worst violators of mine safety rules. And mind you, this is far before OSHA or any modern safety standards, so the standards were already subpar. Because of the unsafe working conditions and the general mistreatment of workers by the company, United Mine Workers of America, UMWA, presented a list of demands that included the enforcement of the 8-hour workday and the right to choose their own housing and doctors. Of course, these demands were all rejected, leading to a general strike by the UMWA. Because of the strike, the workers and their families were evicted from the company towns they lived in and forced to set up tent villages in Ludlow. As tensions between the company's private security guards and striking workers rose, the workers started to arm themselves. However, this only caused tensions to worsen. Eventually, a breaking point was reached in early 1914. The Colorado National Guardsmen, aligned with the company, attacked the Ludlow tent village to try to break the strike, killing 21 people, including 11 children, in what became known as the Ludlow Massacre. This attack on workers caused 10 days of continuous fighting until Wilson himself ordered both sides to be disarmed and for order to be restored. Soon enough, word got around to the public of the violence and oppression of the coal workers, and the ensuing public outcry led Congress to direct an investigation into the events of the massacre and ultimately produce a report in 1915, which was instrumental in promoting child labor laws and enforcing an 8-hour workday. Today, in the place where the tent village once stood, is a historical marker dedicated to the workers, wives, and children who lost their lives over those days, and it stands as a grim reminder of what big corporations in the state itself is willing to do to oppress the working class. Another example of the strikes springing up during the 1910s is the Boston Telephone Strike, which was a 6-day walkout of 8,000 telephone workers in Boston, Massachusetts, all but halting the telephone traffic across the city. Most telephone operators were young, single women looking to earn what little money they could before women gained access to more jobs. Being a telephone operator offered one means of earning money, but it was a very high-stress job. Rigid standards, tight quarters, and always under the watchful eye of managers just waiting for them to make a mistake, and being treated as though they were misbehaving school children when those mistakes inevitably occurred. All for a measly $3 a week, $99 in today's money. In 1912, these workers began to organize in order to gain better control over their working conditions as well as better pay. Led by Julia O'Connor and helped by progressive women who were involved with other movements such as suffrage and trade unionism, the Boston telephone operators staged a short but successful strike. Their organization inspired the organization of other telephone operators in other cities in Massachusetts. These workers and workers of all sorts of professions all over especially used the labor shortage caused by World War I to demand more pay and better working conditions. However, once the economic impact of the war reached a head, business leaders tried to reverse these gains, leading to the 3rd strike for today's video, the Seattle General Strike. Despite some price controls being in place during or after the war, inflation skyrocketed during World War I, causing a cost of living crisis. Now more than ever, workers were demanding better, safe working conditions and an increase in pay to keep up with the increased cost of living. However, these business leaders were also feeling the economic slump and often refused any and all demands. Strikes popped up everywhere, but especially in Seattle, where over 65,000 workers staged a walkout over 5 days. This was not just one industry like the other strikes mentioned today, but rather a citywide general work stoppage, which included 110 unions affiliated with the Seattle Labor Council, representing about 20% of Seattle's entire population. Yes, entire population, not just working population, as non-union workers, small business owners, women, and even children joined the strike. All this started not with big corporations, but rather the federal government itself. Because of the financial demands of war, the U.S. government imposed mandatory wage freezes on all war industries. The trouble started when the war ended and workers demanded a raise in wages in order to keep up with the post-war inflation. Additionally, workers wanted the rights to negotiate with their employers rather than through a federal board, which discouraged employers from meeting their employees' demands. When the workers were refused by both the federal side and their employers, they started to strike. The striking of the war industry workers inspired the collectivization of labor unions and eventually the organization of the huge general strike. While the strike itself was peaceful and organized, the sheer scale of it was enough to panic local and state officials who mobilized police and military personnel in order to maintain the peace. If you know anything about American history, you know that this almost always provokes violence rather than prevents it. Luckily, grand-scale violence did not occur because organizers of the strike emphasized peacefulness and discouraged strikers from arming themselves, even when machine guns were being set up by troops in the city streets. The unions behind all of this ensured that many essential workers were still working, making sure that hospitals were staffed and even setting up strike kitchens where people could have their meals. However, all their efforts were for nothing. After 5 days, the General Strike Committee voted to end the strike. They state their reasons behind ending the strike without making any grounds as, quote, pressure from international officers of unions, from executive committees of unions, from the leaders in the labor movement, even from those very leaders who are still called Bolsheviki by the undiscriminating press, and added to all of these the pressure upon the workers themselves, not of the loss of their own jobs, but of living in a city so tightly closed. Another driving force was the mayor of Seattle, Ole Hansen, who frequently berated the striking workers in several press releases and even comparing them to the Bolsheviks in Russia, who had just overthrown the government and established communism. So the people went back to work with few, if any, of their demands being met, but the ship workers, the ones who inspired the sympathetic strikes in the first place, continued to strike. Immediately following the end of the strike, 39 members of the industrial workers of the world were arrested as being ringleaders of anarchy. Mayor Hansen took credit for ending the strike and promptly, after resigning from being mayor, toured the country giving speeches on domestic Bolshevism, earning $38,000 in 1 year, roughly 5 times his yearly pay as mayor of a major city and state capital. He called the general strike a revolutionary event, citing the peacefulness of it as evidence for its being an attempt at revolution. Quote, so the so-called sympathetic Seattle strike was an attempted revolution. That there was no violence does not alter that fact. The intent, openly and covertly announced, was for the overthrow of the industrial system, here first, then everywhere. True, there were no flashing guns, no bombs, no killings. Revolution, I repeat, doesn't need violence. The general strike, as practiced in Seattle, is of itself the weapon of revolution, all the more dangerous because quiet. To succeed, it must suspend everything, stop the entire life stream of the community. That is to say, it puts the government out of operation. And that is all there is to revolt, no matter how achieved. Because of this accused Bolshevism, Senate voted to expand the work of its overmanned Judiciary Subcommittee to investigate Bolshevik propaganda in the U.S. This committee launched a month of hearings the day the strike collapsed. Unfortunately for the workers in the strike, a few radicals did hand out flyers which centered around revolution and used the strike's power and the publicity surrounding it to try to spread their ideology. These flyers and other pieces of propaganda were major talking points in the committee's report, which detailed Bolshevik atrocities and the threat of the Bolshevik sympathizers in the U.S. bent on revolution. Overall, while the 1910s can be described as a decade of strikes, it was not a decade of workers' rights. Headway was often hard fought and short lived under the pressures of the wealthy and powerful.